It's some, right.
So this is a webinar, infiltration at sites with potential contamination. My name is Mike Trojan. I'm a hydrologist with Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. And my main job here is, besides taking afternoon naps, is to maintain the Minnesota Stormwater Manual. In the room with me are a few folks that, stakeholders interested. I hope they're at the right talk here. I also have Todd Smith here, who is the main architect of or author, I should say, of the construction stormwater permit, and Rebecca Higgins from our remediation program, should any questions arise related to contaminated sites, liability issues, and so forth. With that, I'm going to jump right in. If you have any issues, please use the chat box and let us know. We've heard that the volume is pretty good. This is a little bit different than traditional webinars that we give. This webinar was actually requested of us by stakeholders, and so therefore we are encouraging you to ask questions throughout this. We'd like to answer the questions as they arise. I do have a presentation that I'm going to follow, but the intention is really to help folks that are dealing with this issue, to help them get some clarification on those issues. So I'd like to address questions and issues as they arise. Please send them via the chat box on your computer. Did I lose control here? So submit your questions via text box. If you have joined in via phone and you have a question that is fairly involved and complicated, we can unmute you, I think. Is that correct? If necessary. Some of these things maybe need to be talked through, but we'll see as we go along here. I'm likely to bounce around on the screen. I apologize for that, but it's going to be necessary, I think, we have guidance in the Stormwater Wiki. I'm going to be opening the spreadsheet, the contamination assessment screening checklist in Excel. So the screen, we're going to be bouncing back and forth. I may be moving back and forth. I'll do my best to try to keep a good volume. I tend to have a softer voice, so if I tend to quiet down or whatever, please let us know via the chat box right away. I do have a microphone in the room if necessary. We've received some specific questions, and we will address those at some point during the webinar. I'd like you to keep your questions kind of relevant to the topics as they arise so that we don't kind of bounce all over the place. We kind of keep on track. We will cover, I believe, most aspects of this issue.
Mike,
yep.
You have a question. Will the slides be available after the presentation?
The slides are available right now, actually, on a website that I'm going to point you to in a second. So, right there. So materials and answers to questions will be posted in the Stormwater Manual on a page called Stormwater Manual Webinars. There's the link for it. Just when you get into if you go into the Stormwater Manual in the search box, just type in Stormwater Manual Webinars. You can also access this off of the table of contents or the main page. And it'll show, this page will show all the webinars that we've done, but this particular one will be at the top. Look for the one February 27th. I have the PowerPoint posted. We'll be posting all the questions with answers at some point after the webinar. And Randy,
how many folks do we have on the web?
Approximately how many folks do we have?
49.
49.
Cool.
And that's just people that have tapped in, right? So there could be multiple groups out there. Is that correct? Or multiple people? I mean, that's just 49 people that have joined, right?
That's correct.
So there may be multiple people, and so.
Room with 100 people out there.
Okay. Lost control again. We can go to the next slide.
Here you go. Thank you.
This is the content. I'm not necessarily going to follow it in order, depending on how this goes. Like I said, I'd like this to be an open discussion. It really is intended to clarify issues more than have me present a specific agenda today. I will quickly go over the permit language. I'm going to go through the screening checklist and the guidance. calculating this thing called separation distance, which is, we rely on that quite a bit in the screening assessment for sure. We'll walk you through the guidance that's in the wiki at some point during this presentation. I've got some examples that we can show. And we will be addressing sites with likely or known contamination, not in great detail. That's maybe where there's going to be a lot of questions, but I will point out that if you know that you're at a site that has likely or is contaminated, and we're talking phase 2 or whatever investigations, those are very site specific, and so giving you concrete answers is difficult at those types of sites, but we'll do our best to address the issues that you might have on those. As I said, questions throughout. So here is permit language. So the permit prohibits permittees from constructing infiltration systems where infiltrating stormwater may mobilize high levels of contaminants in soil or groundwater. And so, of course, there's a couple words there. May mobilize. Mobilize, what does that mean? So we wrestled with this when the language was being developed, and we landed on this idea of having to complete a checklist. We don't often like to take people outside of the permit to a checklist or to guidance or whatever, but we felt this was a good approach. So permittees must either complete the MPCA's contamination screening checklist, and if you are able to open this slide, there is a link there, or conduct their own assessment to determine the suitability for infiltration. Permittees must retain the checklist or assessment with the SWIP. For more information, you can access the screening checklist at that link, and we'll go to that link later. So, let's take a couple different scenarios. The first one here is, I'm pretty sure my site has contamination. Why do I have to fill out the checklist? So, the language previously would maybe give you an off-ramp here, but when feasible, infiltration is desirable. There are many benefits to infiltration: water quality benefits, hydrologic benefits, and so forth. It's the practice that's preferred, and we want folks to infiltrate if it's feasible at a site. So even if you think your site might be contaminated, going through the screening checklist is going to get you to take a closer look at your site and verify that, in fact, infiltration is not something that you want to do at that site. There are often places on a site where you can infiltrate even when parts of the site are contaminated. In this diagram, for example, here, this little schematic, we might have contaminated soils and contaminated groundwater, but way up in the northeast corner, assuming north is up in the northeast corner, is probably a good place where you could infiltrate. I don't have dimensions on here, but that might be a place in this particular example that you could infiltrate, in fact. I'm pretty sure my site is not contaminated. Do I have to fill out the checklist? No, you do not if you meet the stormwater permit requirement of infiltrating 1 inch. So if you meet the stormwater permit requirement, you don't have to fill out the checklist. You only have to fill out the checklist if you are not going to meet that construction stormwater permit requirement of 1 inch, retaining 1 inch, infiltrating. However, it might not be a bad idea to do it if you're not 100% sure that there's no contamination at your site, and that's because there are liability concerns. If you are associated with the release, you become liable under Minnesota Statute 115B03. This is a question that we received, and I'm not sure I understand the question exactly, but I'm going to take a shot at interpreting it. What do we do with geotech reports that focus on construction issues instead of possible contamination? When I read this, I interpreted it to mean that people maybe aren't doing, we're so used to doing construction details and addressing construction issues that we're getting reports that aren't addressing this potential contamination issue. And the simplest response I can give to that is, you should do this screening assessment before you ever really even get into the nitty-gritty and the nuts and bolts of infiltrating at a site. The screening checklist was designed to be fairly simple to do. If you think there might be contamination at your site, you really should go through this screening assessment before you actually get into looking at the infiltration system that might eventually end up on the site.
Mike?
Yes.
So that question came in through, wasn't my question, but it came in through me.
Mm-hmm.
My understanding of it was that frequently on projects, people are getting geotech reports, but they're focused on how the aspects of the soil that affect the building on the site.
The structural.
Yeah, so the structural characteristics of the soils, any sort of potential structural problems
Okay.
from the soils, and then they're not seeing the data or information they need to make some evaluations on possible contamination.
Ah, yeah.
So part of the answer may be they need to go back and get the applicants to redo the geotech reports. Tell them, these are insufficient, you don't have the information we need, da-da-da-da.
And certainly the manual, if you follow the manual and use it as guidance, certainly the manual will give you good guidance about the number of borings that you should take at the infiltration site itself. And there's a page in the manual, Understanding Well Boring Logs. If you did a search on it, you'd find it, and that would walk you through the types of boring and how you interpret those boring logs at a site where you might be infiltrating. So at a minimum, we certainly encourage people at the place, at the location where the infiltration system is likely to go in, to take borings and to analyze those borings for mobility, potential mobility issues related to water and potential contaminants as opposed to structural issues. So,
Is there a set of tests that they should be using for that then? I mean, is that logged in the manual?
yep, there is a page in the manual, and I'll take a little note here and remind me if I forget later. We'll show you where that page is.
Okay.
But if you did a search on interpreting soil boring logs, it should take you to, in the search results, this should pop up as one of the top sites in the manual. And that walks you through how many borings you should take and how you interpret those borings and what to look for. Not from a construction standpoint, like Randy was pointing out, but more from interpreting the infiltration capacity of that soil, which is also related to contaminant transport too.
Okay, but okay, it's gonna tell you whether it infiltrates fast or slow or whatever, but is there a list of chemicals that they should be looking for on that?
Not necessarily, no. I don't think that sounds more like something you would get into in more of a phase 2 type investigation, where if you did run into some issues at a site where you bored through something that would look like a contaminant, or you had something on site that's where you would get into the testing. And we don't get to that here because that's such a site-specific thing. We can certainly develop guidance about the types of things you might want to look for at certain sites, and we'd be more than willing to develop that kind of guidance if that would be useful to folks. Right now, we take you to our remediation documents, which are very thorough, but they're also can be somewhat challenging to find exact information that you're looking for. So if there's a common theme of what people would like in terms of general guidance here, let us know, and we'll try to get that information developed. Randy?
So there's an idea that comes to mind, which would be, you've got guidance that's written into the stormwater manual about what sort of analysis, what sort of borings, what geotech reports ought to look at and look like. It may be worth some effort to put that into a kind of guidance package that, say, an MS4 city would simply hand to every project developer as early as possible in the process. When you guys do your geotechnical work, be sure you cover all these issues. And that way
That probably is a good idea.
the project developer would have that right at the beginning.
Right. We see a lot of soil borings where there's other issues to look at too, whereas the groundwater, they haven't gone deep enough. They haven't gone deep enough to find the modeling, because they only went 4 feet deep because they're just doing physical characteristics, like you said.
Yeah.
So yeah, if you have the opportunity to get those details into that before you order the people to go out and do it, or, ask them to go out and do that, if they had a list, like you said.
Yeah.
It would be helpful.
Right.
We do see a lot of soil borings where they're in the area, but they're not quite in the right spot, and they're not deep enough, and they didn't look for the right things. Yeah.
Yeah, it'd be nice to do that better.
And it probably wasn't intentional, it was just the fact they didn't know what they should be looking for, especially if you're building on a site that had already been built on, or had manufacturing on it, that type of thing.
I just want to do a quick check, and the folks tuning in via WebEx, can they hear the discussion here? Just give us a thumbs up, somebody.
I think so. Somebody chimed in and said that was a great idea. Roseville runs into that issue quite often, and everyone hears perfectly now.
Okay, good. These images are in the manual. They're guidance. A low-risk site doesn't mean there's never going to be contamination there, and a high-risk site doesn't mean there's always going to be contamination. These are just kind of guides. If you have undeveloped land use that looks like that, or in most residential areas, particularly if you can get good records going back and so forth, most agricultural land use away from the facilities operations, for example, where there might be tanks, these are generally going to be pretty low-risk sites, and you'd probably be pretty good at these sites. There are some sites where you go out and you should be doing a site visit, and you need to use your eyes and look for things. This gas station down the street, that's a red flag, obviously. Commercial industrial areas, just by their nature, are potentially higher risk sites. If you see a monitoring well, you need to find out what that well's there for example. So these are just examples. So the first step is the screening assessment that I've talked about. We attempted to develop a method that does not require rigorous site investigation or sampling. But we want folks to justify why they're not infiltrating, because we really do want people to infiltrate when it's feasible. It's the best, we believe it's the best practice that's out there. And we don't want you to infiltrate when you're going to move contaminants or when you've got shallow bedrock and things like that. And all that stuff is in the permit and it's in the manual. This is we feel this is a very conservative approach. It's more protective of groundwater than aggressive towards infiltration. And we realize that that conflicts with some of the organizations that you might be dealing with. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But I'm going to go real quickly. Now, here's where I'm going to bounce back and forth, and again, I apologize for that. But we're going to take you real quickly to that checklist, and we'll come back to the PowerPoint and so forth. So if you could click on that link, Cha, thanks. So this is a page called Screening Assessment for Contamination at Potential Stormwater Infiltration Sites. Hopefully everybody can see that. We'll walk through this page later, but for now, I just want to take you to the screening checklist, and you'll see off on the right, that check mark there, there's a link. If you click on that link, that'll take you to the page that has the Excel spreadsheet. You can open that spreadsheet up at the top, right there. It's going to ask you to open it. And if you can just blow that up, that'd be great. So this is the screening checklist. You'll notice a bunch of tabs on the bottom. The checklist itself is on this particular tab. And then there's some other tabs with examples and so forth and links. So there's basically three parts to this, and I think maybe I might reformat this to identify those parts a little bit. But we're going to skip boxes 1 and 2 for now, because those are places where we know we have or have had contamination in the past. But boxes 3 through 14, if you could scroll down just a little bit. Yeah, boxes 3 through 14 are the on-site assessment part of this. Yep.
I hate to do this just before you get farther into this. When I go through the web page in the manual and scroll down to the checklists, I get two options.
Yes.
Can you explain? So one of them is just a straight file name, and the other one has the date July 2018.
It's the second one, with the date is just a reformatted version of the first one. There was something, I can't remember exactly what it was, but there was something in the original version that I thought was a little bit clunky. It didn't change the checklist itself. I think it made it a little easier to use. So but the reason we didn't delete the original checklist is because some folks might have been using that one by that time, so we kept both options there. So
is the one with the date the older original one?
that is the newer one.
That's the newer one.
Yes.
Okay,
So
thank you.
that one, and it's just a formatting issue. And so if we ever reformat this to make it a little easier to use, and if you have ideas about how to do that, let us know. We will always update it and put it in manual, but we'll keep the old versions because we know that some people might be using those. And we'll try to tag those and let people know that, hey, this is a better version. We think it's a better version, a little easier to, but nothing's really changed in terms of functionality between those two. So, yep.
We have a question that just came in. You talked about the difference between mobile refueling versus permanent refueling. Is there a difference?
Does anybody know the answer to that? Is that something that the person has come across, those terms? Can they,
Good question from Abby. Can you state your question?
I haven't heard those terms used, mobile refueling and,
Permanent refueling.
what was the other one?
Permanent refueling. I would think some of it could be associated also to mobile sprayers and so forth, that they might be for agricultural purposes, but
Yeah, if we could
another
get,
one would be just gas. For example, if you're in the construction industry, you're sitting there and you're bringing tank trucks out to refuel your equipment instead of bringing them off the site.
yeah, if we could get some clarification on that. I learned, back when I was defending for my prelims, I learned at that point in my life to never try to fake my way through an answer.
So she's gonna try and unmute. Abby, if you wanna unmute.
Okay.
Hi, this is Abby.
In.
Are you there, Abby?
This is Abby. Can you hear me? I'm trying to unmute.
It's an easy have to unmute her.
She has to unmute herself, too.
Are you unmuted? Make sure you're unmuted too, Abby.
I think I'm unmuted.
There's that. I wouldn't be able to do it from my machine.
They can hear her, we can't hear her.
Oh, we can't hear her, everybody else.
Can't hear. Huh.
Hello, does that work?
Everybody on the
A lot of
web can
things
hear
have
her.
to come together.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm sorry, we can't hear you here, so unless we can get that resolved, we're gonna have to try to deal with it through the chat box. If you wouldn't mind maybe typing in a little explanation in the chat box, I can come back to that question in a few minutes here. Until we get that resolved, I'm gonna keep moving on so that we don't keep folks hanging out there, but we'll come back to that if we can get a little bit more clarification. So boxes 3 through 14 are the on-site portion of this screening checklist, and it walks you through boxes 4 through 12, walk you through a bunch of things that you maybe should be looking for at a site. And something came up yesterday that's not on here, which would maybe be underground stuff that you can't visually see. So this is not perfect. If there's situations you've come across, we'd like to hear about them, and we can enhance this checklist in that manner. But if you get to box 13 and you've checked one or more of the boxes 4 through 12, then you get to do this thing called determining a separation distance from that particular feature. Can you get far enough away from that feature to make sure that you're not going to have a mobility issue? So if we could bounce back to the PowerPoint, and you'll see there's links in this checkbox too. And go to the next slide. Oh,
You have control.
I got control. That's always a dangerous thing. So these are the things that that you should be looking for at a site. Is there an underground tank or vent or fill port, like in the upper right, for example? It doesn't mean there's contamination there, but it means it's something that you're going to want to look at. Is there a monitoring well on the site? Are there covered soil piles? Generally, if piles are sitting out there and they're not covered, they shouldn't be an issue, unless somebody's not doing something that they're not supposed to be doing. Obviously, stained soil, vegetation, unusual odors. And these are odors that are on site, not the wafting from the restaurant across the street. Mismanaged drums or containers. Obviously, the lower right, that would be a concern if you went to a site. Excavations that are not backfilled with clean material. Presence of debris that may harbor contaminants. Or the site is a confirmed hotspot. And we do have a page in the stormwater manual that talks about stormwater hotspots. So just type in stormwater hotspot if you're in the manual, and you'll go to that page and find out what all of those are. Do I still have control of this? You checked any box 4 through 12 and can't clarify if it is a concern, and by that I mean, okay, if you go out and you see a monitoring well, every monitoring well should have a tag on it with a unique number. You can copy down that number, go into the county well index, look up that well, and if it says it's just a monitoring well that the USGS put in, for example, for monitoring purposes, you're good to go. So just seeing these things on a site doesn't mean you should not infiltrate. You should check them out if they're there. So if you can't really check them out, if you haven't been able to get a good read on exactly what it is, then you try to achieve separation from that feature. And what separation? There's always going to be a groundwater mound under an infiltration system. So when you infiltrate, there's a temporary, water builds up temporarily under your infiltration practice, and that mound spreads out radially, and we wanted to identify how far out does that mound extend. That's what we're trying to do. Is that mound going to extend out far enough that if there's contamination in groundwater, that it's going to hit that contamination and start to move those contaminants? And so we need to calculate that distance. It sounds fairly onerous, and it can be if you decide to get into rigorous models, but being very thoughtful that we are, the public servants, very thoughtful public servants that we are, we have actually developed some numbers for you. And I got Randy laughing, which is always good. So there's three options here. You can just use the default values that we have in the stormwater manual. You need to have two things. What is the soil underneath your BMP? And of course, if you've done your probes correctly, you'll know what that soil is. And you'll need to know what the aquifer material is. And you should be able to get that from various sources. If not, you can always assume a worst case scenario. So for example, if you have a fine sand over a coarse sand aquifer, your influence zone is 75 feet. This influence zone is calculated using the second bullet, which is the USGS mounting calculator that we'll look at later. And whatever number we came up with for this scenario, using that mounting calculator, we doubled. So there's a safety factor built into the separation distance that you see in this table here. So in fact, for example, coarse sand over gravel aquifer, the influence zone, the calculator came up with 400 feet, and we doubled that to include a safety factor. The second option I've already mentioned is using this USGS mounting calculator, and we'll actually open that up later and take a quick look at it. And there are other options, acceptable methods. You may actually want to do a groundwater model at your site for, if you want to do a mod flow model or something like that. You have more than adequate, more rigorous than we're actually asking for, but we're not going to complain if you do that. If you have no features of concern, or you can achieve the separation that you need to from that feature, then you move on to box 15. So let's go back real quickly to the Excel spreadsheet if we can. And so boxes 15 through 28 are an off-site assessment. And so you're basically going to look for the same things that you look for on your site, but these are now going to be off your site. And the reason being that if you stick your infiltration system way up in the corner of your property, and groundwater is moving away from your property onto the adjacent property, you don't want to mobilize any contaminants that are off-site either. So this is the off-site portion of the screening assessment. And you can see that you don't get any green boxes, which are the green lights to go ahead and infiltrate, until you've gone through both the on-site and the off-site investigations. And so if you go through these boxes and you've checked nothing in the previous on the on-site assessment, or you're able to clear those features, and you're able to do the same here, you don't have any boxes checked, or you've been able to clear the features, you're good to go on infiltration. And those are the green boxes. The orange boxes are those places where we're telling you that you do not have to infiltrate. That doesn't mean don't infiltrate. You could infiltrate if you want, but you have adequate justification in our minds at this point to not infiltrate. So if we can go back to the PowerPoint quickly, and let me know if there are any questions that pop up too.
Amy did provide some clarification on her question. If you want to get to that now, or?
Yeah, why don't we go ahead and do that?
Okay. So back to your question about mobile refueling versus permanent refueling. Her clarification is that the explanation of mobile fuel tanks is accurate. Sometimes construction sites bring mobile diesel or fueling tanks to sites for vehicles. I was wondering if mobile refueling like that precludes the site from infiltration.
So is this, if this is a feature that's brought temporarily on site,
Yeah, they bring a portable tank and they have it there, and their Bobcats and their dozers can fuel up with the diesel that's there.
Yeah, if it's a temporary situation, I don't think that should be a problem unless you've got a tank that you're bringing on that's like my old Ford Maverick that leaks gasoline as you drive along.
And if they have a leak of over 5 gallons, it needs to be reported to the Minnesota duty officer and a new leak site formed.
Yeah, so those should not be a problem, provided everybody's following the rules that they're supposed to be following. I hope that answers the question, but if not, let us know. So, let's go back here to the next slide, please. So this was the off-site assessment. You'll notice that the on-site and off-site assessment part of this, we're really concerned with groundwater contamination. We're not, I shouldn't say we're not concerned with soil contamination. The thing about soil contamination is we feel that you can go to a site and you can see those features that are going to potentially cause groundwater contamination. You're not going to drill through a soil pile, a dump on your site, we hope, for example. You're not going to drill and put an infiltration system right next to a monitoring well that's associated with a leaky tank site, for example. You can see these features. What we're worried about is the stuff that you can't see. And that's why we want the separation distance, and we want you to stay away from those things on a site that might lead to groundwater contamination. So you go to the next slide. So just a couple features of the checklist I already mentioned, as you have to go through both the on and off-site assessments before getting the green light to infiltrate. You may choose not to infiltrate anytime there is a feature that might contribute to groundwater contamination. We feel this is the conservative part of it. You go out and you find a monitoring well, it doesn't have a tag on it, you don't know what that well is associated with, you can't achieve a separation distance, you don't have to infiltrate. Just document it and keep that for your records. And we do believe that is fairly conservative, but we're in the job of protecting the environment first. Infiltration is always desired when it's feasible, but we don't want you infiltrating if there's any chance you're going to mobilize contaminants. And the decision to infiltrate is based on separation. I've talked about that. Next slide. So I'm going to quickly go through this mounting calculator that the USGS has developed. It's based on the Hand-Touche method, for those of you who are familiar with that. You need 6 pieces of information for it. It looks onerous, but of course, we believe we give you pretty good information to help you find these 6 parameters that you're going to need to input. You're going to need the infiltration rate of the soil at the site. This is actually the amount of water that you're infiltrating. So if you have a rain garden that's 1 foot deep, that's your infiltration rate. So that's a little bit different than I think we're typically used to thinking of infiltration rates. It's actually the amount of water, that's the way it's phrased in the calculator, infiltration rate, but it's actually the depth of water that you're infiltrating through your infiltration practice. The aquifer-specific yield and aquifer hydraulic conductivity, and we'll have table values that I'll show you for those. The length and width of your infiltration practice, that's something that you should know. The duration of infiltration, that's going to typically be 48 hours or less. So if you're on a really sandy soil, even though the permit requires you to infiltrate in 48 hours, you're going to want to actually input the length of time that you think that it's going to take for that depth of water to infiltrate. And then the initial thickness of the aquifer, which by default is 10 feet. This is probably the hardest parameter to get, and we suggest just if you don't know what it is, just leave it at 10 feet, which is the default value in the calculator. So if we could click on that link. Yep.
So this question seems appropriate because you're still talking about the aquifer. Where does the soil beneath the BMP end and the aquifer start?
It's not the seasonal high water table. It is the place where, well, that's a good question because it's going to vary during the year, or is it the seasonal high water table? That's a good question. I'm not sure we answer it. I mean, as a hydrologist, I know it when I see it, but I'm trying to explain it here, and it's so the best way to do it is the best way to find out where that is to put in a piezometer and drill until you get to saturated soils. Let the piezometer sit for a good 24 to 48 hours and come back and measure the water level. And that's the best way to do it. If you're taking a soil boring, it would be a place obviously where you reach saturated soils. There are also some redox parameters you can look for. If you encounter blue clays, for example, in your boring, that's probably an indication that the water table is up in that level at some point during the year. So there's a couple different ways you can do that, and that's a good question, and actually we probably should provide some guidance on that.
Do you want me to?
No, you can jump in, sure.
So for the purposes of any contaminated site, whenever we're doing an investigation, our guidance dictates what the aquifer definition is, and that is a transmissivity of greater than 50 square feet per day. So you need to be cognizant that when you're doing an investigation looking for groundwater, you should be collecting grain size analysis, having them analyzed in a laboratory, running your calculations as appropriate per grain size results, and then estimating your aquifer thickness based on what you found in the field and published atlas data, and then coming up with your estimated aquifer thickness and multiply times your conductivity to get your transmissivity, and if you meet the 50 square feet per day or greater, then you are considered to be in an aquifer setting for the purposes of an investigation for contamination. So
Okay.
I would assume...
It'd probably be helpful for you to identify yourself for the folks on the
Right. This is Rebecca Higgins. I'm a senior hydrogeologist with the Petroleum Remediation Program, and I'm just here representing sort of the contaminant picture side of things.
She's been instructed to throw things at me when I misspeak, so... But she brings up a good point, which is that if you're at a site where you don't really think there is contamination, but you want to identify where the water table is, just a soil boring where you get wet soils is probably good. If you've got a site where you might have contamination, their standards, the things that they look for in the remediation program are much more rigorous. So this guidance that I think we probably should develop will probably have multiple paths to go down depending on what you're looking for at a site.
I think it's also critical to remember that we're talking about identifying where groundwater currently exists, and just because it may not meet the definition of an aquifer setting, doesn't mean it is not groundwater, and it doesn't mean that it's not impacted groundwater. And if you're adding water to water, you are very likely changing the hydrologic setting. Common sense says that if you are adding water to water, you will have a different result in the subsurface once it has reached equilibrium. So monitoring that over time is logically the next best course.
Right. Part of the reason I asked the question, though, is you've set up this nice, simple, conservative separation estimation tool. It depends on evaluating the soil beneath the BMP and then evaluating the aquifer material to come up with a separation distance. Your answers to where that interface is are relatively complicated. For the people that want to use a really simple conservative tool, you need to give them a really simple way to determine where to make that call as to where it changes.
Yeah, and I think a stepped approach here based on what you feel you may encounter at a site. Like I said, wet soils might be fine at some sites. At other sites, you're going to want to drop a piezometer in or something like that.
Right.
So it's going to vary.
We have an online question.
Yep.
It was mentioned earlier that the checklist was only required by the permit for cases where infiltration was not going to be implemented. However, on the last slide, it was stated that you must complete an on- and off-site assessment in order to infiltrate. Could you clarify this point?
Yes, I can clarify that. That slide is a mistake. I misspoke. If you're going to infiltrate at a site, you do not need to fill out that checklist. So I'll correct that and put the corrected version on it. I'm used to being corrected. I've been married for 35 years.
Okay, we have another question regarding monitoring. Why should we monitor the site and go the extra effort monitoring if the table says infiltration is not necessary?
That gets into some interesting questions. The PCA, I believe, stormwater program would say you do not have to infiltrate. The reason you might want to infiltrate is because there may be local requirements other than ours. You may want to infiltrate just because that's the best BMP option for you at that site. So once you fail the screening checklist, the PCA is saying you're good to not infiltrate. So we're really not expecting you to be aggressive towards infiltration in that situation. So I don't know if that directly answers that question or not, but we do acknowledge that there are local entities that feel we're too conservative, and that's fine. It's okay to disagree, but from an agency standpoint, if you fail the screening checklist, you do not have to infiltrate. Okay,
Mike?
Yeah.
I've got a question on that. Would it be appropriate to rephrase that in saying that the PCA would actually prefer that you not infiltrate? I mean,
no, I don't.
Once you fail the checklist, you're kind of saying it's not safe.
No, I don't think that. I mean, and we could discuss that. My initial reaction to that is no. If you have the ability to do a phase 2 investigation or whatever, and we want you to infiltrate if you can. What we don't want to do is force you into a situation where you have to do a phase 2.
Right.
We see in St. Paul, for example, the Ford site, where or maybe the Midway is a better example, where I think they might be doing some infiltration. I'm not sure about that, but let's just assume that for now that they are. Well, we know that that's an old bus depot, and we know there's a trichloroethylene plume under the site and so forth and that. But they want to infiltrate. We're fine. The big thing, of course, is make sure you do a good investigation and you're aware of the liability issues. So we don't want to put people in that situation where they could become liable. But does that address your question?
Yeah. Thank you.
So yeah, I don't think we would want to say we prefer that you don't infiltrate.
Part of the issue is this is a general permit. We cover 2,000 projects a year. We
Yeah.
don't have oversight on a lot of the projects, so we want to give people an easy way to go through this, not end up with an infiltration basin where there shouldn't be one.
Right.
There will be cases where they probably could have, and they built a pond, and we just don't have the oversight for all that. But if you're working with somebody at the local level that really is aggressively pursuing volume reduction, and they want to dig into the USGS model or any other sort of investigation and determine that it's acceptable, we would accept that too.
Right. Thank you.
Okay, Shaw, if you could go up in the right corner in the page contents and just hold there for a second, and go down to item 2.5. There we go. And so you're all going to get a little lesson in navigating the wiki here too. So 2 for 1. So being an old man, I can't see anything, so I'm going to have to move over here, and I'll try to keep talking loud, so hopefully you'll be able to hear me. But we have a bunch of links here in this section. So this is called Determining If Adequate Separation Can Be Achieved, blah, 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 blah. So we do have guidance on using the calculator, and if you could right-click on that and open the new tab. There we go. And scroll up, and here's the table that's got links to all of this great information on determining hydraulic properties of your aquifer and so forth and specific yield. Let's just click on one of them, for example. Let's go on this link here for specific yield. This will take you to a table, I hope. That will tell you if you have a coarse sand. These are from a whole bunch of studies and shown in the footnote here. If you want your average specific yield, it's in column 18. So if you have a coarse sand, your specific yield for the calculator is 0.27. So if we can go back to the other tab.
I meant to call somebody else. Sorry about that.
So that table will have links to all kinds of information. So let's click on the actual, up at the top here, the simple tool developed. Thank you for making them not have to stand on my tiptoes. Click on that. And that opens the USGS website, and Excel file is right here up on the right. Click on that and open it up. Hopefully it'll let us open it. Try it again. Come on. Is it thinking or is it stuck? It's stuck. It's stuck. Okay. Should we try it again, or are we pretty sure it's not going to open?
Yes, may I please speak with the inspector? I'm
Yeah,
not
go
sure.
back,
I got a
and then
message
go
when
back.
I was told to press
Go
the
back,
inspector.
or yeah, just try to open it again.
Okay.
Shoot. Well, okay. Close your eyes. I'm going to try to walk you through this. When you open this Excel spreadsheet, you'll have those 6 inputs that I talked about before. And using the tables, or if you already have the site information or whatever, you're going to need those. Let's go back to the PowerPoint maybe. So you're going to need to input these 6 values in there. Infiltration rate is going to be the depth of your practice. So that's, let's say you have a 3-foot infiltration basin. It'll be 3 feet. Specific yield, you can get either you'll know it or you get it off that table. Hydraulic conductivity, you have to know your material. You can get it off that table, again, if you don't know it at the site. The length and width of your infiltration basin, you should know. The mounting calculator spreadsheet will ask for the midpoint of that. So if you have a 50 by 50 infiltration system, you would input 25 feet in that cell in that spreadsheet, and it says that there. So you just be really careful when you enter values, when you read what it's asking for. The duration of infiltration is the length of time it's going to take for that water to move in. It's going to be at a maximum 48 hours. It could be considerably less. And then, as I said, leave that initial thickness of the aquifer at 10 feet. Then there's a tab on there that basically, I can't remember exactly what it says, but you'll hit that and it'll recalculate. And maybe the tab says recalculate. So when you hit recalculate, it'll show you the mound, but it'll also give you a table of values that are distance from the center of your practice, and it will tell you what the height of the mound is. Yep, Randy?
So I did succeed in opening it up, and I'm looking at it. It's not a tab, it's a big blue button,
Okay.
and it says recalculate now with some
Recalculate.
text next to it.
So you see this big blue button says recalculate now, and you hit that.
The one other interesting thing about this is the spreadsheet has a number of macros
Yes.
embedded in it, which I'm running it through a company, essentially, so my company disables all the macros automatically.
Okay.
I get an error message. I have no idea what that does to the function of the spreadsheet, but that's going to be something for people to watch out for. It may be that you're going to have to talk to your IT people and get the macros enabled
Okay.
when you run this.
Okay, so hopefully everybody heard that there are macros built into this, and that could be an issue. We, again, did run, I remember doing this because I drank a lot of coffee during it, but we ran many scenarios, and I'll see if I can find that in the wiki. It's always sad when the person who's responsible for the wiki isn't quite sure where something is in the wiki, but I'll try to find that place where we've done all of these runs. If you can't get it to run on your machine and you can't get it organized with your IT folks, that table may be of value, and I'll try to find that later. So when you hit that recalculate button, you'll get a table off to the left of that button that'll show you a distance from the center of your BMP, and it'll show you the mound height. What you want to do is you can change that distance, and you're looking for the USGS recommends, and then we took the USGS recommendation. You're looking for a mound height change of 0.02 feet, at which point we consider that to no longer have an impact on the groundwater system. So you need to adjust those distances from the center of your practice until you come up with that 0.02 feet. That is your separation distance minus the distance of the practice that's included in that. So if, let's say your practice is 50 feet, like I said, 50 by 50, you're 25 feet in the center. Let's say your separation distance is 125 feet. Using this calculator, you got to subtract off that 25 feet underneath the practice. Your separation distance would be 100 feet. We recommend that you double that, and you come up with 200 feet. So I'll try to put some examples in the wiki to help people walk through it. It's really not as complicated as it sounds. It's a pretty simple tool to use, pretty slick.
We have a couple of questions
Yep.
online. One is about using wet sedimentation basins, the other is about regarding the checklist. So, first question, per 15.5, I assume that's a permit reference. If infiltration is determined to be too risky due to contamination, can a wet sedimentation basin or filtration basin be used exclusively, even though it doesn't result in a volume reduction?
Todd, you want to handle it?
Yeah, that is what we would want you to do, is one of those other non-volume reduction practices.
Would we want the filtration system lined?
Yes. Yes, we don't have a requirement for ponds to be lined, although it would be recommended. As far as the permit goes, it's not actually in the permit right now.
So,
But
yeah.
those are the other BMPs we would want you to look at, something that doesn't have that interaction with the groundwater.
Good job.
Question number 2, can you please clarify again about when the checklist is required to be filled out? My understanding is that the checklist or equivalence is needed for any site that triggers permanent stormwater treatment.
Yeah, I think you said that maybe 2 times differently. The permit does ask that you either fill out the checklist or do some other type of analysis, for all sites if you're doing infiltration.
Even if you're doing infiltration?
Yeah, that you've at least looked at those basic things, and we're able to check no on all of them.
Okay.
You know, in the spreadsheet.
Okay. So, thanks Todd for being in the room, because I thought it, so I misspoke. I thought that if you just flat out went ahead and infiltrated, you did not need to do the checklist, but that's not correct?
We want you to at least do that minimum investigation, yeah.
Okay, so I stand corrected. We do apparently want you to do that minimum investigation.
And about the basins, what type of liner for filtration basins?
Ah, I'm glad you asked that, because I'm always proud to show off the wiki. You could go back to the wiki.
You gonna change it?
Just do up when I go to the table of contents. And voila, we have a page called Liners for Stormwater Management. And this page should help you to understand what type of liner you should use at a particular site. And there's basically 2 types. If you could just scroll down just a little bit. We have liner level 1. You can scroll down a little bit more. We have level 2. And I believe, I'm not 100% sure, but I'm 99% sure that we're recommending level 2 liners when you have contamination at a site. And the specifications are here on this page, so the minimum thickness should be less than 40 mils and so forth and so on. So hopefully that addresses that question regarding what type of liner we would recommend at the site. We can go back to the PowerPoint unless there's some questions. Well, you know what, tell you what, I'm sorry. Why don't you stay in the wiki and go back to the, go up to the top of the page, table of contents. Sorry folks, I'm going to walk you through real quickly here. It's stormwater infiltration, contaminated sites, soils and groundwater. And let's see here. Let's go ahead and go to the screening assessment. Page contents down to 2.5. And let's see if we can find that. Here we go. Let's try this link here. How to predict the extent of a mound. You could scroll down. Keep going way down. There we go. Go back up. A little bit more. Right there. So this is we ran a whole bunch of scenarios using the mounding calculator. And so if you're having trouble opening that calculator, this table and this chart here might help you derive that influence zone, the distance. If not, and you're having trouble opening that mounding calculator, give us a call. We'll see what we can do to help you in that situation. And I'll try to put these links on the, we have a record of all the questions, right? So we can try to put the questions and all the answers on the wiki when we're done. Okay, if we can go back to the PowerPoint. And let's go ahead and go down to the next page. Okay, so what if my site was contaminated? This is boxes 1 and 2 in the spreadsheet. And we don't need to go back to the spreadsheet, but box 1 basically says you know that this site is contaminated or was contaminated. And if you answer yes, then box 2, you're gonna have to answer the question about, well, has the site been remediated? Or basically, has an investigation been done at the site sufficient to allow you to pursue the rest of the checklist? If the site's has known contamination, and you can't verify that it's been cleaned up or whatever, then you're gonna get stopped right at that point in the checklist, and you won't need to infiltrate, following the checklist requirements, so. If you could go to the next slide. Okay, so I think we've been over this, but I'll just repeat this. I failed the screening assessment, now what? You are not required to infiltrate under the construction stormwater permit. Document your decision and keep it on record with your SWIP. I noted there may be local requirements more stringent than the construction stormwater permit. And, but the construction stormwater permit, under that, you do not have to infiltrate. You may choose to further investigate. Presence of one or more of the features in the checklist does not prove contamination exists. And I'm trying to make that point that this is a fairly conservative approach that we've taken with infiltration. We do ask that you try to pursue identifying what those features are and the history behind them. But if you can't, then you fail the checklist and you don't have to infiltrate. If you do pursue further and you fail the checklist and you do pursue further, you may want to do a more rigorous phase 1 investigation, or in some cases you may need to move on to phase 2, which involves actually monitoring or sampling at the site. Okay, the next slide.
There's a question, trying to understand this, is the MPCA checklist and phase 1 equivalent? And it doesn't need to be physically kept with a SWIP at the construction site, does it?
I believe the answer to number 2 is it does not need to be, or well, Todd, you get that one.
You are required to have the SWIP at the site. There are elements of the SWIP that our inspectors are not necessarily interested in, this being one of them. This is all for site planning purposes. So no, if it's not at the site, it's not going to be a problem, as long as you're able to produce it.
And then the first question, can you repeat again?
I think they're asking whether the MPCA checklist and a phase 1 are equivalent.
They are close. We modeled the checklist after a typical phase 1 that the remediation program would have. They are not exactly the same, though. The checklist is a little less rigorous, and I believe a phase 1 we're done through a remediation program where we strongly recommend, or maybe it's even required, that you have a licensed geoscientist. And we say it's a good idea to have a licensed geoscientist, but the intention was for the checklist for somebody who's not necessarily a hydrologist or an engineer or whatever to go out and be able to do this assessment.
So you're talking about documentation, keeping it on record, and then you're saying keep it with the SWIP. That would apply if this process is being done by the owner and owner-operator of the construction project, right? What my question basically is, we're going to have cases where you've got a city that is a local regulator and not the owner-operator of the construction site, and as the local regulator, they're going through this process. I think your suggestion would be they should document their process, they should keep it on record as part of their MS4 permit record keeping, part of the plan review process. Is that appropriate?
Todd?
Yeah, I think that sounds appropriate.
I think we have a documentation requirement with respect to minimum control measure 5 that would require, it's a little vague, but I think it's pretty broad language that
right.
asks the MS4 permittee to keep on record anything related to the decision making related to the plan review and approval of a project. And this would I think can reasonably be considered one of those things to keep on record.
Okay. You might wanna expand this section of the guidance to cover, a local reviewing authority as opposed to the owner as opposed to just the owner-operator of the construction project.
And for clarification, on Phase 1 environmental site assessments, they're to be done in accordance with the ASTM 1527 standard, and that requires that a qualified environmental professional be overseeing the work itself. So a qualified environmental professional doesn't necessarily have to be the one doing and assembling the report, but it has to be overseen and quality control checked by a qualified environmental professional, so.
And I think that that's the main difference, because we really did model the screening assessment after a Phase 1 that would be done. We ask you to do a lot of the type of record checking and things like that would be done. But it was more intended for somebody just to go out and do a quick look at a site. Hey, this looks clean. I know the history of the site. It's clean. And I'm not a licensed geoscientist, but I am, but the person who's on the site might say, I'm not a licensed geoscientist, but it looks good to me. I've done everything they said to do, and it's clean. I'm good to go. So that's probably the main difference between the two, is that we don't require that, have that requirement for the screening assessment.
We have a follow-up question on the checklist. Please reiterate and talk about the note in box 2 of the checklist about the closure letters. If the answer to box 1 is yes, has the contaminated soil or groundwater been remediated to acceptable levels? Note, closure letters sent by the MPCA do not assure that a site is not contaminated. Then click on the link in cell 3 for more information. If yes, proceed to box 3.
Do you want to touch on that one?
Sure. So this is Rebecca Higgins. I'm, again, with the remediation division, not the stormwater folks. So closure letters mean different things. We have different types of closure letters depending on what type of remediation program you're in. There are no further action letters. There for non-petroleum sites. There are closure letters for petroleum sites. But effectively, from a large-scale perspective, those letters simply mean that the risk to receptors has been evaluated at the time that the letter is issued, and that they do not pose a risk to receptors based on the information we have at that moment in time. They are a moment in time, and that's the important piece to remember. So in petroleum, in the petroleum program, for instance, we have every reason to leave our petroleum contaminants in the ground as long as they are not posing a risk to any receptor and they are naturally degrading and stable. So if those conditions, along with a number of others, are met, we issue site closure. That does not mean you do not have impacts in the soil, groundwater, and soil vapor that can be mobilized if you were to add a whole bunch of water. So in the case that you have a site where you have a closure letter, it does not mean that the site is necessarily clean when that word is used as this grandiose notion of a pristine property. You also may have properties down gradient of yours where you may think about infiltrating, and that water travels downhill. So if you plan to infiltrate and potentially are impacting not only your site or a site down gradient or cross gradient, if you're not sure where your water is going to go, then you may want to be very cognizant of those impacts to your property and others around you, so that you are not potentially becoming liable for those contaminants if you were to mobilize them and either change the closure scenario or pose a new risk to receptors based on that infiltrating water.
You may have answered this next question, but I'll ask it just in case it needs more clarification. If the MPCA has issued a petrol tank release correction action letter, for example, from 1992, and then closed the correction action due to remediation, is this site viable for infiltration?
This is where updates to the site conceptual model are necessary. So what we develop when we investigate a site is something called a site conceptual model, and it is effectively a three-dimensional description of what is going on site between the contaminants, the subsurface setting in which it sits, and the receptors that it could be impacting. When you have a site closure, and what they mean is that corrective action was done on a site, in this case in 1992, that corrective action remedied the contaminant scenario to a degree at the time that did not pose a risk to receptors. That does not mean that it would not have changed since then, and it does not mean that it would not be altered by any future infiltration. So there's two things that play there. Number one, what has happened since the time of closure? You need a status update for your site conceptual model to understand your fate and transport and how it exists right now. And then you also need to understand furthermore and into the future what your infiltration may do to that scenario. So number one, get it up to speed to where it is today. And number two, understand what your infiltration could do to that scenario now and in the future.
Could we go back to the wiki real quick? And let's go back to I'm sorry. Okay, I'm not going to find it. I'll find it quicker in the PowerPoint. Let's go back to the PowerPoint real quick. Sorry, Tom. And then let's go back up to that table associated with the mounting calculator. There we go, right here. One thing, when I hear this discussion, one thing to keep in mind is that most, not all, but most infiltration systems are not going to be particularly large. Now, obviously there are exceptions where we've got big infiltration systems, underground systems that infiltrate an awful lot of water. And the mounting calculator will give you a big mound. But, if we're talking about fairly small BMPs for the most part, unless you've got really coarse materials, like coarse sand over gravel, and that, these separation distances are not great. So I would really want to stress that. If you go to a site and you go, oh my gosh, there's a groundwater plume clear on the other side of my site, and it's 1,000 feet away, you're probably going to be okay at that site. There are exceptions, so I'm not telling you to go ahead and do that, but just keep in mind that these separations, groundwater moves really slow, and these mounds are not huge under most of these systems. So just something to kind of keep in mind.
So I had a question I had been meaning to ask related to this, which is in, say, older cities, you're going to run into situations, I think it's called urban land, urban soil. It's essentially whatever's going on is over 40 feet of God knows what, something that got demolished or an old brickyard or it's impossible to determine. You could do soil borings at 1 foot intervals and you still wouldn't know exactly what's going on. How do you address sites like that when you're trying to apply this table?
We're probably looking at the fill part of this here.
Okay.
Generally, if you bring material in and it is fill, it's going to be a mixture of materials usually. If it's a coarse sand, if you bring a sand in, you're going to know it's sand. But if they're bringing just
This isn't bringing in fill. It's basically you're building something on a site that's got a long history of nobody knows what.
Yeah,
and that's what your soils are.
And I shouldn't have said bringing in fill, because at some point somebody brought in fill.
Right.
So these are sites that have fill on them. And generally the fill is going to be a mixture of materials. And it's always going to be the finer materials in your fill that are going to control the movement of the water. So unless you're sure that you've got coarser materials, I would recommend using this fill category here.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, because there's a lot of them, like Highway 100, when they put it in, all of that stuff just went to the side. And you know,
Yeah.
then they built the road.
Yeah. Yeah. And so generally, unless they're bringing in good, clean sand or something, those fills are a mixture of different kinds of materials. Okay, so could we go back to where we were, wherever that was?
Do you have another question?
Well, I was just questioning, in a lot of these, if we can't absorb stuff, and I've put in a lot of sports fields over the years, which are sand-based fields, if there's a way to line them, you could actually have great landscaping and absorptive capacity in that first foot or foot and a half of material, and it would be a way to still give you a landscape look without having a contamination underneath like we did at the University of Minnesota and those sites there where the TCF stadium went in. Those 3 grassed areas out there are all sealed because of what was there previously.
So those sites are all lined out there?
They're all lined with EDPM liner.
Okay.
And then a drainage system that holds a certain amount of water and then lets the filtered material beyond there go to the watershed clean.
And obviously, if you can maximize your treatment, that's always a desirable thing, so. Okay, let's go, so I'm gonna do a couple examples. Those questions that did get forwarded to me will come up later. So, let's go to the next slide. So, it's hard to give concrete answers to some of these, but this is one that came to us a couple days ago. So they want to put in potentially a permeable parking lot and maybe an infiltration system. They have a building there shown in gray. There were 2, I believe actually, well, I guess they were underground storage tanks, 2 underground storage tanks at the site. So obviously you go out and you know those tiny tanks are there and you check those boxes and you would fail the checklist here, but we're asking you, don't just check the box and walk away from it. Try to find out what you can about those tanks. Have they been removed? Are they still there? Has there been a reported release? Anything like that over time. You have fill soils present. Try to find out what you can about those fill soils. That would be a bit of a red flag too. And there's former structures that were demolished and uncertain about how material was disposed. So all of these would be red flags in the checklist, and you might check the box, but we ask that you follow up on them. When we go to the guidance here in a little bit, we'll provide you we'll show you some information and links to places where you can hopefully get some answers to these questions. If you can't answer these questions, then yes, this site would fail, even though it's very possible that this is a good site. Go to the next example. And this example is actually in the manual, the wiki. Although I don't get into the detail about sampling, because in this particular example fails the screening checklist, and in the wiki what we've got it as a failure. Don't infiltrate at this site. But we have a proposed swale shown in the yellow or green, and it's over B soils, so good soils for infiltration. No current or past history of contamination. We got this above ground fuel tank in the red to the north of the site of the proposed swale. And we have separation distance. We got stain soils shown in whatever color that is at the bottom there. What color is that, Sean?
Tan.
Tan? Yeah, I was going to say tan, but I didn't want to embarrass myself. I put clothes on every morning. I go to my wife, does this look good? And she goes, yep. And then the separation distance, we calculated as 200 feet, and that includes a safety factor of 2. And you can see the scale up on the top. We would fail at this site because those stain soils are within 200 feet of our proposed swale. However, so in the manual, that's where it stops at this point in this example, is we say you're done, you failed. But let's just take an example here and take it a step further. We want to infiltrate here. Well, at least we want to pursue potential infiltration. So let's go to the next slide. So we go out and do a bunch of borings, and the borings are shown on the stars, and the results are off to the right here. And what we find is we compare those borings, we find that the groundwater is clean under the site, but we find that there's some copper in some of the samples. And so we report that copper in the table on the third column, and we have a concentration in the soil. We compare that to the SLV. That shouldn't be the SLV, I'm sorry, the soil leaching value is in the far right column. That's the number we don't want to exceed. If we exceed that number, then we have a potential for releasing copper to the shallow groundwater at concentrations above the drinking water standard. So we have two situations where we're above that SLV, and a third one where we're pretty close. But we've got 4 places where we're good to go. So you could, on this site, you could infiltrate. If you understood groundwater flow and you felt confident in the data, you did all the QA/QC right for the sampling and the analysis, you could infiltrate in the green portion, but not in the orange portion of that swale. So it would be your choice at this point what you would want to do. So this is an example of maybe taking it to the next step, where the screening checklist, where you would fail. Construction stormwater permit says you don't have to infiltrate, but you really want to give it a shot. And so this is maybe a very kind of a light type of example of investigation that you might need to do. And it doesn't get into all the QA/QC that you need to follow in that, but obviously we want to make sure you're getting good samples. Next slide. Scenario 3 is just a real brief summary. So we've got off-site contamination. We talked about that. In this situation, if you're down gradient of the site from a groundwater standpoint, or up gradient for that matter, you want to make sure that you have that separation distance again. So this infiltration practice, the mound, this just shows an example of how the mound can extend to a contaminant that might be at the groundwater table off-site. And you're looking for that distance. I believe it's 0.02 feet. I could be wrong about that. I'll have to double check it. It might be 0.25 feet. But anyways, there's this distance that the USGS recommended that you, at some point where the mound is that height or less, and you should be good to go.
Mike, what does DTW stand for?
Depth to water. So that's the depth to the water table from the bottom of your infiltration practice. Next slide. Okay, I'm going to take a look at some of the questions we've received so far in the mail, and if you have questions, keep asking them. I'll do my best to answer some of these. The first one I addressed, what do we do with geotech reports? Second one, how do we address spacing when we have insufficient information about location of the contamination, the way in which the plume is moving or changing, and groundwater flows? And Randy, you sent this question to me, and maybe you can provide some enlightenment to me, but this looks like a site where we're pretty sure we've got contamination, and we've got a plume, and the construction stormwater permit would say at this point, you don't have to infiltrate. You failed the screening checklist. So this question really is not applicable to the construction stormwater permit if that's the case. However, if you do want to infiltrate, then you need to go out and do a proper investigation and define the plume. We have guidance in the manual. I'll show you where that is in a bit. That takes you to guidance about how to do a site investigation. And you would need to do that to address that spacing issue. If that addresses the question.
Yep.
One note of caution here too, and then Rebecca, you can get ready to throw something at me here if you want. But there's lots of different scenarios out there. You have different types of chemical compounds. You have BTEX compounds typically associated with gasoline. You have chlorinated compounds associated with dry cleaning, for example. They're completely different animals. And so we're not saying go ahead and infiltrate if you think it's BTEX and don't infiltrate if it's chlorinated. But just be aware that the level of concern between your contaminants really does change. The BTEX compounds most of the time are going to degrade in groundwater within certain distance of the source of that contamination. Chlorinated plume is likely to go on forever. No, not forever, but for a long way. And the risk numbers are, except for benzene, the risk numbers are very different between those two. Always, when in doubt, always do a receptor survey too. Are there drinking water wells close by? Are there surface water receptors close by? Cap Region just put in a new building, and they put in a neat infiltration system. They had contamination at the site. Okay, let's just say it does fail. They did all the right stuff, but let's just say it does fail. They're in St. Paul. There are receptors. Are there receptors close by? What's the risk of failure? That's really an important thing too. And I don't know if you want to jump in here and add anything here, Rebecca, but I think you really need to make sure that if you have a drinking water well and you're concerned at a site, don't infiltrate in that situation.
Yeah, this would probably be a good time to step in and talk a bit about that site in particular. So, quick question for anybody on the phone, not to wake you if you've dozed off from us rambling, but do we have... You said throw something. I thought I'd throw words. No. Do we have anybody on the phone from either the Cap Region Watershed District or BAR Engineering today?
I'm with Barb.
Oh, you are?
I didn't know that before.
Okay, well, there we go. Okay, so, yeah, I just wanted to make sure I knew who we have with us in case we have experienced people that are going to know more than I do.
I know there were some folks that are on the phone too.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, great. If we do have BAR folks on the phone that did work on the Cap Region site, please feel free to amend or addend anything I'm about to say. I have not prepared a presentation per se on this, but I think it's a very, very important site for us to all know about and study and learn from. So what was known as the McQueen Equipment Site in St. Paul on Aldine Street is now the Cap Region Watershed District Headquarters building. And this site came into us in 2017, roughly, and it came through our petroleum program for our brownfield assurances because they were going to redevelop the site into the headquarters. So it was a former, we'll call it light industrial building and property in general, historically speaking. And they were renovating the office and shop into office space and then replacing one building with a lab and garage. They were doing grading work and then construction of basically every single stormwater feature possible. They wanted to demonstrate this site as everything you could possibly do to improve your stormwater treatment. So they wanted to infiltrate, and we had a small problem with that because we had a previous leak site on the property where we know we had petroleum contamination at depth. We knew it was old and degrading. It was not posing any risk to any receptor from when we gave it closure, but at this point we said we need to know more about it before you go ahead with that. And they said we really want to infiltrate. We said that sounds great. So let's go forward with what is really the ultimate end-all be-all of options, which is monitoring the groundwater system and knowing what you're about to infiltrate into, and then monitoring that in the long run and modeling it in the meanwhile so we know what we can anticipate potentially in terms of impacting the plume and would it move, would it not, having a scientific basis for this estimate. So they did exactly that, and we couldn't be more excited about the project from a remediation standpoint because it kind of sets, no pun intended, it sets the bar for what we could do on future sites. So anywhere you have contamination, it may not be a stop. It may not be your final wall in infiltration. So we want to see infiltration done wherever it can be as well. And this site really did exactly that. So within their response action plan, which is a report that they send in for how to mitigate contaminated soils when they're in the redevelopment process, within the response action plan, initially they had sent in a report basically saying what they were going to do and gave it an attachment from BAR, who created the groundwater modeling report. So I have a copy of it here today, And this is all publicly available information. If anybody's taking notes at the moment and they would like to do an open file review on the site and look through everything we have on it, I'll give you those numbers right now so that you're not wondering what they are later. That is for leak site number 20265 and for billing ID number 103330. That is also called our AIID in a system called Tempo. So if you call and want to do a file review, the AIID is 103330 and the leak site is 20265. So it's also Brownfields number 216. So regardless, we had a whole bunch of knowns, and I'm going to give this a gross overlay. I'm going to gloss over a lot of the details because it's all found in the reports. I won't go into the minutia. I'm going to leave that for Bar to present, and I know they're planning on, in concert with the CAP region, with Forrest Kelly, and so it was done for the CAP region for Forrest Kelly, Mark Donau. Bar's team was Eric Lund and Evan Christensen. And then from the remediation MPCA side of things, the VIC team is Chris Formby, and the Brownfields for petroleum side of things is myself and Mark Coplitz. So any of those folks can be contacted to ask more questions, and we're happy to share everything we know about it. So, so when Bar created the groundwater modeling report, they basically put in what we knew about the contamination at depth, and it was, from a petroleum perspective, it was not extremely significant contamination. We see much, much, much nastier sites than this. However, we still had impacts that were significant enough to say, well, if you impact that and it mobilizes it, then we have to continue down the path of monitoring that situation, and you will not get to a closure point. You would effectively just become responsible for it. So there's that liability piece. So when they did this, they were doing it from the petroleum standpoint initially, and then they evaluated on the groundwater modeling report all of the VTEX constituents and what the model showed, which was let me just, before I move on, I want to say exactly the type of model it was. It was a ModFlow, let's see here. It was the ModFlow groundwater flow simulation, and for contaminant concentrations and understanding the model with contaminants and how it would affect them, they used a USGS transport code MT3D. So you have to overlay the ModFlow with the contaminant piece of the puzzle when you're modeling, and that's the simulation that they created. And so they effectively came to this endpoint where we knew there was potential for the water to get there, but was it going to appreciably affect the contaminants as we knew them in their worst case scenario? The answer was it was not going to appreciably affect them, and if it did, in fact, it may have this beneficial remediation endpoint. So we've talked a lot about this throughout the 6 roughly years that we've been trying to get our hands around this issue, and that is the idea of beneficial remediation through infiltrated clean groundwater. So for contaminants like petroleum that naturally degrade and are benefited by an oxygen-enriched environment, creating that oxygen-rich, fresh, clean water into the system can actually help remediate it. So this model shows that there is a potential at some point for that to occur if the model holds true. And so they are continuing to monitor the site in the long term. So now that the redevelopment is complete and we're on the back end of this, they're still monitoring it, and they will continue to monitor it and send us the reports. And then they'll be presenting on it, as I understand it, this year in any number of conferences and meetings and the like. So our hope is to get this in front of everybody as soon as we can. But beyond the petroleum piece of this, there was a complicating factor, and that was that came in the midst of the redevelopment, and that was that we found the adjacent downgradient property had a PCE plume that was not fully investigated yet, so there was a huge number of unknowns, but that there was PCE to be dealt with in the groundwater. So that piece of the puzzle was amended with additional modeling, so they went back to the original petroleum model and then overlaid that with the PCE knowns at the time, and came to the conclusion that they felt comfortable taking on the liability risk because the models showed that even at the property boundary, the groundwater mound that was going to be created was negligible. It was it was approximately a ½ inch of mound at the property boundary, and that wasn't necessarily going to intersect the known PCE contaminants down gradient. So they felt at the time they were comfortable with going forward with infiltrating, and we're continuing to monitor over time now. So the complete closure of this, or complete endpoint of this story is yet to be determined, but that's where we're at. It's the absolute best case scenario in terms of monitoring and modeling a site that has known contamination. And if you'd like to take a look at it, it's not, it's not guidance because we've never done this. This is all emerging guidance, emerging technical issues. So do we have this all written down and detailed spec for what modeling parameters we expect to see from our end of things? No, we don't have that. We're not there yet. But do we hope to get there eventually? Sure. I mean, as guidance is needed, we create it. So if as stakeholders you feel that you'd like to see more technical guidance from the remediation program, then you have to voice that to the remediation program that you're dealing with and indicate that you would like to see this in a more concrete way. And then we hopefully can respond in kind to that and help get to a point where we can all have a workable solution to this. So, but this is the best and most recent example of taking this all the way to the nth degree. So.
And I was talking to Rebecca before the webinar. We hope to get this into the manual as a good example, if that's okay with everybody.
Yeah.
So this would be a good example of a site where you would have failed the screening checklist, but they wanted to do infiltration, and we're successful.
So, question and a comment. One is, do you know how much, even really approximately, all this cost? And if you do write it up, including cost information would be useful.
Yes.
Yeah, that would have to be Cap Region's decision to share that or not.
Okay.
But they're very helpful and informative team of folks. So, like I say, hopefully I'm not going to get a call later saying thanks for the inundation of phone calls and emails. But
Forrest is not here.
Oh, good. Hi, Forrest. And Forrest, feel free to jump in, add anything you'd like to this conversation. I'm sure people would love to hear it.
He said you summarized it far better than he could. Thank you.
That kind of leads into the next question on here, which is how much expense is reasonable to expect or demand for an accurate delineation of a contamination plume. Obviously, the PCA would not demand anything in this situation. You would have failed a screening checklist and not have to infiltrate. So the question becomes, well, if I want to pursue infiltration, how much is it going to cost? And that's going to be a site-specific answer. We could try to provide some case studies with numbers on them, if that would be useful to people. We'll do that. Some things are more expensive than others. BTEX compounds are kind of in the middle range. I mean, if you're going to go out and you're going to start sampling for PAHs, it's going to cost you a lot of money, for example. If you've got some metals, maybe not quite as much. So, depends on the extent of the plume, the extent of the contamination. It's going to be a site-specific thing. But like I say, we can try to get some good case studies with some of those numbers in there, if that would be helpful for people.
And Forrest says they will compile total costs for the investigation and make that available.
How do we balance the prudent urge to avoid any possible contamination with the regulatory pressure to infiltrate? Again, the screening checklist is designed to not really put pressure on people to infiltrate. We understand that there may be local entities that have more aggressive requirements for infiltration, but you're not going to get pressure from us to infiltrate at these sites. If you do infiltrate because of you want to or because of local requirements, then you'll have to meet those more rigorous standards, including potentially a phase 2 investigation. Go to the next slide. Now, I'm not exactly sure what page it's recommending, but I think I have an idea. The guidance on a certain page recommends creating a groundwater model if there is known contamination near a desired infiltration site. What about collecting empirical monitoring data, and how does that play into your recommendations? And monitoring, if done properly, is always, I think, a preferred approach to modeling. In fact, monitoring is good to get information to help feed a model such as MT3D or ModFlow. You wouldn't want to build those models on table values if you, in fact, you could go out and collect information. So monitoring is always, I think, a better way to go about this. Empirical data, you have to take it with a grain of salt, and that, if I'm understanding what is meant by this, for example, when I talked about using the USGS mounting calculator, using those table values, and that's why when you use those table values, we recommend plugging in a safety factor. I'm going to sidetrack a little bit here and tell a story. When I took a ModFlow training class many years ago, I had hair back then, one of the instructors was actually the author of the ModFlow model. And there was an engineer, and I'm going to insult engineers a little bit here. There's an engineer in the audience, and he was all about numbers. You know, what number do I have to get, and what significant digit do I have to get for my on-site hydraulic conductivity? And the guy who wrote the ModFlow model said, I just look it up in a book. So empirical data is reliable, but I would recommend putting in some safety factors. If you use that data, you don't have good site information. And other folks can jump in here.
Yeah, if you're going to put in a monitoring well network, then certainly go to the length of doing slug tests and getting actual good numbers to base your decisions off of. This is not something you want to just take a order of magnitude guess at. You want to know what your on-site subsurface aquifer conditions are. Go for the extra data.
This next question kind of touches on that a little bit too. You have technical guidance on that modeling and empirical data. Collection should be done. Questions that need to be addressed. Spatial and temporal resolution, number of years of data collection, and so forth and so on. So this is very detailed information that's being asked here. We link to that information that the remediation program has put together. Very good information, but I went into it yesterday just to kind of take a look at it, and I went, wow, I am a licensed geoscientist, I'm a hydrologist, I know how to dig through that stuff, a lot of people don't. And so the first thing that occurred to me is maybe a lot of folks would benefit by us going in and extracting information from that and putting it in a little bit more user-friendly format. So I think that this question kind of gets at that maybe we could develop some general guidance to help address these types of questions. We're never going to tell you how many wells you should put in or borings you should put in at a site, because every site is different. But we can provide some basic QA/QC information, information about how to interpret boring logs, and things like that. And we could even put some case studies in if we get some good case studies.
Mike, speaking of guidance, there was a question a few minutes ago. Is there a guide to SLVs and concentration levels of the suite of contaminants that can be present that helps flag sites as potential sites where you can't infiltrate?
And that kind of relates to what I just said, and I didn't say it in quite those words, but we could develop that guidance. It does not, we don't have it now. I don't know if the remediation program has it, but yes, there are suites of chemicals that we can recommend you look for in certain situations, and I think we can develop that guidance.
And our investigations are based off of not just SRVs, SLVs, groundwater hurls and the like. They're based off of initial investigation field work parameters that include screening criteria by, PID readings, olfactory and visual indications of contamination, and then building off of those screening criteria, sampling appropriately, and then doing analytical that gives you results that you can then compare to established standards, which are the SLVs, SRVs, RAAs, and hurls. So, of course, MCLs as well. But those numbers are all numbers you compare your analytical data to. So there's analytical parameters, the standards to which we set cleanup values for particular contaminants, and then on the very, very front end of that is just the simple fieldwork screening criteria.
And I think there are some general categories that we can develop some guidance around. For example, if you have a site that had a leaky gasoline tank on it, you're not going to go sampling for chlorinated solvents, for example. So we can develop suites of things that you should look for at that particular site, if I'm understanding the question correctly.
Is there a general timeline as to when this guidance can be produced?
Well, the Phase 2 guidance, Phase 2 and leak site investigation, petroleum guidance, that already exists. So if they would like to explore the petroleum program's guidance, it is thorough, it is reliable, and it's up to date. So they should definitely go and seek out those guidance documents to understand the process through which you do a contaminant investigation, so that you're not just doing this in the blind. That walks you through it very, very succinctly and already exists.
As far as extracting that information and putting it into our wiki, maybe as a separate page or whatever, it's something that I need to talk to our supervisors and management about. If it rises to the top of our priority list, then it could very well do that. I don't know. If it does, we could probably start working on developing that guidance later this year. But I can't make promises. Obviously, we have limited budgets, but we do have some ability and resources to start developing that guidance. Like Rebecca said, the guidance already exists. That's not the issue. The guidance is out there. People can find it. What I suspect, though, is that people could benefit by extracting some of that guidance and putting it into a different format.
And one suggestion, quick reference page for the upper limits of those values would be great.
Okay. Yeah, and it occurred to me that, I helped develop, I was on the risk teams way back in the 90s that developed these numbers, and so soil leaching values I know what they are. I wrote the modeling to develop those numbers, and so then it occurs to me, well, a lot of people have no clue how to come up with a soil leaching value, and so I think we need to put ourselves in the shoes of the people that are trying to use these numbers and understand them. So any help that we can get on that would be valuable and useful for us.
And in particular, people should just, sit down and start having conversations with their environmental professionals in-house. Talk to your environmental department and get their take on what steps are most appropriate for your site, because they are so site-specific and they're scale-dependent. So I would say talk to your in-house environmental staff and let them help you walk through next steps for investigation. That's really what consultants are for. So,
unless there's more questions, we go to the next page.
There's one more. It's both construction and MS4 related, so it could probably be directed to you or Dwayne. So MS4 permittees are required to have regulatory mechanisms as strict as the CSW permit, construction stormwater permit. MS4 permittees are also required to review and approve all SWIPs of private construction sites, with the CSW permit requirements that is being discussed today being very technical with significant time and expertise possibly needed to review and approve a plan. What review assistance can the MPCA provide MS4 permittee reviewers? Would the PCA take over review of the screening requirements if requested by the MS4?
The short answer to that last part is probably not. We wouldn't be able to do that. But with regard to the at least as stringent as phrase in the MS4 permit, that only applies to minimum control measure 4 and active construction as it relates to erosion, sediment, and waste controls, and has nothing to do with post-construction stormwater management, which is a whole different area. So I don't know if that addresses the question adequately. During the site plan review and approval process by a regulated MS4, we would expect that to include this assessment. This language is not yet in the MS4 permit that is out there, it's not in the expired permit, but we do expect to mimic or mirror the CSW permit requirements with regard to infiltrating at contaminated sites when we do reissue the permit this fall. So we would expect the review and approval process to include the city engineer or whoever taking a look at the site plans in this regard and treating it the very same as a CSW permit project proposer would be looking at it, to be consistent.
Is there no technical guidance available? Who can we contact to discuss these topics and gain insight in developing a modeling plan? This again is sites that have known or very likely contamination. As Rebecca stated, there is guidance out there, and that's what we take people to from the wiki. But I'm sensing that there might, based on these questions and some of the other ones that we've got, I'm sensing there might be a need to develop some additional, make it a little bit more accessible, maybe is the way I'm kind of phrasing it. So we can talk about that internally here and work on it. As far as contacting folks, you can certainly contact the stormwater program if you have questions. We can't provide assurances to people, but we can look at what your questions are and try to help you answer questions as we go along.
And that's hopefully after you've talked to your environmental professionals and they've helped guide you through what to expect next and what involvement you'll need between the two programs, the VIC and the Petroleum Brownfields program or Petroleum Remediation program if you're on an active leak site. So they'll hopefully help walk you through those steps. But, you know, when it gets to the point of a site like Cap Region that went for the gusto and did the full monitoring and modeling plan, when you get to those points, you'll hopefully be already in contact with a team of folks here in the remediation program that are going to help walk you through what you need, what's appropriate, you know, what not to go too far with, and help you get to this endpoint where you've got good quality data in the long term.
And if you have a site that we feel you really should be talking to remediation folks about, and you contact us first, that's what we'll do, is we'll send you to the remediation folks. If you follow the guidance on this page, and I'm not sure what page, but doesn't matter, and it results in an outcome showing that infiltration is not expected to negatively impact contamination, you're still liable if something happens. I assume this means if you go ahead and infiltrate, are you liable? And the answer would be yes, you are liable. So, as I said before, there are different, again, Rebecca, you can get a tomato ready. There are different levels of liability. If you impact a known receptor, a drinking water well, surface water, and so forth, you've got contaminants like TCE that are, or PCE, whatever, that are really problematic. Your level of concern should be very high. Other sites, as Rebecca said, you may actually be helping it, although maybe we're not supposed to say that.
So that probably answers the question that just popped up here. At the beginning, you mentioned that if our infiltration causes the plume to move, we will be held responsible. If that is the case, what is the reward for taking on the risk of infiltrating?
A closure letter. So you could potentially become a responsible party and responsible for investigation and cleanup actions if you mobilize and cause negative risk to receptors or change that conceptual model in a negative way. That would determine potentially your responsibility to that contamination. But on the opposite side of that coin, theoretically, you have an opportunity to beneficially remediate a plume, but you would need to demonstrate that. And at the end of all of that, if you were to associate yourself with that liability and go through the monitoring enough to say, we have positively remediated this plume, then at the end of that, you would have ended at, closure of some kind. No further action or closure, depending on your program. So that is the end point for remediation. If that's determined after you've effectively proven your lack of risk to receptors.
Which could take how long?
Indefinitely. I mean, we have sites that come in and out of our program very quickly, and in, maybe 1 to 2 years. But then we have sites that are decades long. So it depends on what, if you're talking about the St. Louis Park, steep Dean apple plumes, then that's a very different story. And those are very, very difficult to remediate, and we're still at it. So if you're talking about that, that's very, very different than a very old hydraulic oil release at an old, car shop that is shallow and degraded and is still there, but it's not posing any risk. And if you've impacted that and you know it and you've helped remediate it and you can prove that, then that's probably not nearly the same level of risk. So it all depends on the site, of course, which is why it's an in-depth process, and that's why data is always your friend. The more data, the more information, the more history you have on a site, the better off you are to evaluate those conditions now and in the future, and that risk.
I think this is an evolving area, and I think right now the stormwater program is erring on the side of conservatism, and as we learn more and gain more information, maybe we'll be a little bit, think differently. I don't know. We'll have to see, but.
I think part of what's behind the question is people are thinking if there's any possibility of contamination, the knee-jerk response will be, okay, don't infiltrate. If you are going to infiltrate, you're taking on additional analytic cost and you're taking on additional liability. So don't do it. And the question is, what's the alternative to that response? And as far as I can tell, the alternative, and Cap Region is a good example, which is you have to be really enthusiastic about infiltrating stormwater for whatever the hell reason, in order to take on those additional costs and liabilities.
I think one thing to remember about this is that I think people get very easily scared off by the depth of technical knowledge and awareness you have to have when it comes to this subject. When you talk about large-scale systems and large sites, I think what everybody needs to remember is that it's not new science. We're not applying anything to these evaluations that we don't already know how to do. We know how to investigate a site and create that current site conceptual model. We know how to monitor it in the long term, and we know how to model it. So why not apply all of the science that we have at our fingertips when and where it's appropriate? If it's a large enough benefit to go forward with, then why not? If you've got the science, it's not that complicated to put together. You just simply need to have a lot of conversations, and you need to make sure you're enveloping all the stakeholders, your stormwater people, your environmental people, your legal people, your responsible parties, or your owners, and making sure that everybody's at the same place along the line. So communication is really, really pivotal, and just this awareness of being able to reach out and use these tools we already have. So like in my mind, I like to say, let's use the science we already have. We're not recreating anything. We're just applying good old science.
Yeah, that's true, but I believe that with Randy is if you're a private developer,
Mm-hmm.
you're gonna say, boy, this is expensive. If you're Rice Creek Watershed or, the city of Blaine, they may say it's worth it because now we reduce our stormwater output to the Met Council or whatever, So as a government entity, you might be more likely to take on that liability than as a private developer.
And when we put the screening checklist together in this approach, we were thinking of the small sites to developers. That's why we are erring on the side. And we understand that it's somewhat contrary to are encouraging people to infiltrate, but we don't want people moving contaminants, and we understand it's very expensive. I worked in a remediation program for a while, and you see these numbers coming through for how expensive it is, and it is not cheap. And then at the end of the day, you still have potential liability issues. So, in those situations, you know, it's a case-by-case situation. Like I said, I'm not sure, should I infiltrate or not? Well, then how big a risk are you really taking? You know, are the receptors really close, and what kind of contaminants am I dealing with, and things like that have to enter into the discussion. And our program is saying you don't have to infiltrate.
We have a contribution to the conversation in CRWD, I believe that's Capital Region. CRWD regulations switching from infiltration to filtration nearly doubles the required treatment volume, so there is a cost savings if a site can infiltrate. It will come down to balancing the cost of investigation and risk with the cost of larger systems.
So they get charged per unit on the discharge, stormwater charge? Do they get charged per unit? I apologize for my ignorance.
I'm not sure. It sounds like maybe in some fashion they do. There are other things that enter into play. I mean, if you really need to meet some volume requirements, if you have a total maximum daily load and you really want to infiltrate for whatever reason, there are other things that enter into the cost equation that can offset the cost of investigating a site too. And those are all going to be in a case-by-case situation. Unfortunately, even though we know the science, we're constantly running up against different situations. I think we've answered that last question about regulation. You want to move on unless there's a...
There is one about more on regulation. Could the local regulating MS4 be held liable of contamination mobilization on a project that was reviewed and approved?
I don't know, that would be a question for you, Dwayne, I think.
Yeah, I don't know if I can accurately answer that right now. I mean, we've never run into that scenario. Since the inception of these requirements, not much time has passed, and so we may not be in this we may not have to answer this question for years to come. We just don't know right now, and I would have to seek a legal opinion on that at this point. I don't know the answer.
Well, for those questions that we were unable to answer or unanswered completely, we'll try to get some better answers if we can and put those into the wiki at some point down the road. Okay, if we can move to the next slide, unless there's questions. So at this point, I want to take folks on a quick tour of the manual, if that's okay, just to show you what's in there. If you could click on that link. I'm going to move over here, so hopefully I'll try to talk a little louder. So this is the main page called Stormwater Infiltration in Contaminated Soils and Groundwater. And like all our wiki pages, it's got figures and it's got warnings. I recommend that you read the warnings. Whenever there's a warning in the manual, it's related to a construction stormwater permit requirement. So that's what this warning is saying here, that it's prohibiting infiltration when you're going to mobilize contaminants. Excuse me. So this is the portal to this page, and you can see that we've got several pages here that we have developed and linked to. If you want to right-click on, let's go through each of them really quickly. Right-click on that and open a new tab. Oops. Right-click on new tab. Open it in a new tab, and we'll just then go to that tab. This is just a general information page, and if you hit the table, hover over the page contents here, it'll tell you the types of contaminated sites and likely pollutants. So this kind of gets a little bit at that question earlier about what you might encounter at certain types of sites. We can refine that better. But if you're at a brownfield site versus a tank site, what are you going to potentially encounter there? What makes a site contaminated, and that's where we bring in the risk numbers, the hurls and the SLVs and those kinds of things. And then some other general information. So if we go back to the second. There, yep. Let's go to this page here. The new tab. Yep. And then this is just a quick guide for people. It has permit language. What does the permit language mean? Because I know that there's permit language, which is not usually accessible to people who speak English. So there's a paragraph below that tries to explain. Sorry, Todd.
It's supposed to be short, short and efficient.
So then there's this paragraph that explains what it means, and then there's links to the screening assessment tool. So this page is intended to be kind of a quick guide to the permit. So let's go back. And the screening assessment, we're going to spend a little bit of time on this page here. This is kind of the big one. So if you hover over the page contents, there's this checklist, and it talks about the checklist, and then it contains information for conducting the screening assessment. So why don't we go to that part of the manual. And so this is where you'll see some of the stuff that I've shown in this presentation. What kind of information are you going to need to do this screening assessment? We've got some pictures here, and then we're going to go down, so just scroll down. The first box is 1 and 2, and maybe I should put that in the title here. Does the site have soil or groundwater contamination? So this is boxes 1 and 2 of that checklist. And, you know, if so, if it has contamination, has it been remediated to acceptable levels? This gets into that issue of giving assurances and that type of thing. And so if you scroll down, so let's just say those boxes 1 and 2 in the checklist, you're good to go. Now you're going to do a property review. Some of the things we recommend that you do, we give you links to these sources of information: street directories, aerial photographs, topo maps, Sanborn maps, historical and assessor records, and there's links to all of that kind of stuff in here. There's a link to what's in my neighborhood here, which is going to, I'm sure all of you are aware of that tool. It's a nice tool. It shows all of the known sites that are RCRA sites, as well as tank sites, as well as Superfund sites, as well as brownfield sites, and so forth. Shows the location of those. And this is going to be a really important source of information for a lot of you. It's what's in my neighborhood. Really nice tool. If you're on a site, if there is a site close to you, you can click on a site usually and get information about that site, including, in some cases, actual monitoring data and access to the reports. So let's scroll down. So how do you go out and conduct a site visit and determine your influence zone? And here's some more discussion about those things to look for: underground storage tanks, monitoring wells, and so forth. Again, for example, for monitoring wells, it says monitoring wells are typically 4 inches or less in diameter, so we're trying to give you some information. You go out and you see an 8-inch well, it's not going to be a monitoring well, so you probably don't need to be concerned about that. If it is a monitoring well, should have a metal tag on it. It has a unique ID. You can go to County Well Index. We've got a link there. Go to County Well Index, find that well, and find out why is that well out there, what does it do. And so there's that kind of information here for these things on the site and what to look for. This is determining that separation distance that I talked about earlier. We spent quite a bit of time on that. Links to the USGS tool up there. Measured values, and a link to predicting the extent of amount. That's where you're going to find that information on aquifer properties and so forth. And then we go through 4 examples. Example 1 is pretty straightforward. These are really simple. I think we need to give maybe some more detailed examples in there. But first 2 examples, you pass the screening test, so you got to go out and you got to do a what's in my neighborhood thing. You look at some historical records, aerial photos, whatever. But examples 1 and 2 are sites that passed. Example 3 is the one that I talked about earlier, one that failed. In the manual, we didn't go into the next scenario, which is I want to infiltrate, which I did during the presentation. And then example 4 is an example where you're going to fail in box 1 of the checklist, and you're going to stop right there. So what if I want to pursue infiltration at my site? And then that's when you get into an actual phase 1 or possibly even a phase 2. And for that, understand the risks of failing at a site, retain a licensed professional, and then here it talks about what a phase 1 is, and then it talks about a phase 2 assessment here too. And then at the bottom of each of these pages, there should be links to all kinds of, and here, I'm sorry, here's the links to all of the QA/QC monitoring, modeling, all the type of information that the remediation programs have put together. So this is what I'm talking about. Maybe we should go into this information here. I don't know why I'm doing this, nobody's seeing it.
We are.
Go into that and extract, yeah, that's right. Extract some of that information and bring it into a different format in the manual. We go down, there's a discussion about liability issues. And then one thing you know at the bottom of most pages in the manual is that around a specific topic, this one being infiltration at contaminated sites, we give you links to any of the other pages that are related to that topic. So using that quick link, let's go to stormwater infiltration guidance. And we're going to take the owl off here because I think we're getting pretty close to good to go in here. Now let's just hover over the table page contents again. So this is a site where we have a high potential or known contamination. So what are the concerns at this site? How do I know if the site's been contaminated? What constitutes an appropriate environmental review? Who to contact? What is the high level of contamination, and then an overview of the risk-based criteria. And we provide some example determinations of risk-based criteria. I think these could probably be a little bit better. Let's go ahead and go down to number 9 here. And these are some examples where we actually dig in. You just scroll down. These are some examples of some phase 2 investigations that we've come up with. You can scroll up just a little bit, please. Keep going up. So we give an example here of a site where we've gone out and done some sampling, and we compare it to the risk criteria, and we either fail or we pass. So that's that page. Yep, let's go there. And go to the links page here. And there would be links to our cleanup guidance and the petroleum remediation guidance, brownfield program, Superfund program. I think that's it, but I'm not sure. Yep. So links to their to what their programs have and links to their pages. Go back. And then case studies. We do have some case studies in the manual. Just hover over the page contents. I'm not going to go into these, but you can see that we've got 5 examples. Green line, light rail, this is one example that's on here. We hope to get some more in. Hopefully get the Cap Region one in. It sounds like a really good one to get in here. Hopefully the folks at Cap Region will let us do that. Let's go back. And then links to other information. And that would be just some general links. Some of this is like EPA stuff and so forth. So that's kind of a real quick and dirty tour of the stormwater manual. There's a lot of stuff in there, but I think we can get more in there and help folks forward. Did any more questions pop up in the meantime?
We have a former gas station site that had a spill and a plume that got into the groundwater. Monitoring wells were set up and eventually removed, and the MPCA allowed a new building to be built. The building is now for sale, and 2 prospective buyers have backed out of the deal because they fear unknown costs for remediation, mitigation of the old plume in regards to the new vapor regulations. Do they have a legitimate concern, or would the site be sellable without liability to the new owner? As the MPC had a written had written a letter at the time clearing the site for development, but left it open to reopen the investigation.
You know the answer to that?
The answer to that question is more complicated than we can get into here today, but basically that is a liability risk decision that they will need to make on their own. They need to do adequate investigation to current standards, and that should give them whatever level of assurance they're seeking in making that business decision, but that's effectively a business risk decision that we can't answer for them. They have to make that on their own. So definitely speak to our petroleum brownfields project management team. You can call them at any point and have that long discussion with them if they need assistance, but they definitely ought to have an environmental professional consultant giving them advice on what steps come next.
If I could ask a question, maybe is they're not liable for anything that's already there, correct? But if they do something to enhance the movement of that, then they would become liable. Is that correct?
It depends on the context of the question. If the question is related to infiltration, that's kind of a different story. If you're talking about if they would become liable for old contamination, that's what the due diligence process is based on. You perform due diligence in order to protect yourself from liability by performing a phase 1 and phase 2 to document that either conditions have not changed since the time of closure, and then you're given an assurance at that point, or a closure confirmation saying that nothing's changed and will not be reopened. And so that's effectively what the due diligence process is all about. It's about proving that you have not been a responsible party and that nothing has changed, and then you are assured of liability protection once you've performed all of that work and demonstrated it. It's been reviewed by the PCA, and then that's what our brownfield assurances are based on.
Should the seller then, in fact, do that recertification now so that his customers are assured that there would be not a problem?
Typically, it's the buyer that performs the due diligence because they're the ones seeking the liability protection. So it's usually the buyer, the purchaser. It's all under statute, and so it basically says that as a purchaser, you want to perform that investigation to demonstrate that you are not responsible for anything, and that in the future you've had that you carry no liability forward because you are not the person either as the tank owner or operator, and you have not contributed to making or exacerbating the problem. So you want to perform that before the purchase is complete. And this is what consulting is all about. They walk them through that entire process. So to make sure all the I's are dotted and T's are crossed.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any other questions pop up?
Not about that, but there was. Are you opening the floor up to?
I think so. Let's go back to PowerPoint real quick. I think that's about it. So, so let's go to the next page. Yeah, we'll take any questions at this point because I'm done, literally.
Well, earlier we had one about sharing information within the MPCA. When is information on contaminants shared between MPCA units? For example, is information about soil contaminants only shared with staff when a request for permit is submitted? For sites that are interested in infiltration during site planning and have already completed a Phase 2 ESA reviewed by VIC or PDP staff, does the stormwater staff at MPCA review the portion of response action plans related to stormwater management? If not, what would be the best time or manner to share site information related to stormwater?
Do you want me to take that? Yeah, okay, so the Petroleum Brownfield Program guidance right now, if you go to the PBP page, and it's Brownfield's Response Action Plan guidance that you need to be reading through, and in that we require for response action plans, a portion of your response action plans to include discussion of any planned stormwater infiltration on site. And in the response action review process, that is the VIC team and the petroleum brownfields team that review that. And then, although we cannot give explicit verification or design criteria changes to or comment anything about the design for the stormwater infiltration, what we can do is take that into consideration of our overall site conceptual model. And then we can include in our RAP approval letter that either you may want to consider moving or changing your design or something along those lines if it's appropriate, because if we think there's a risk to the contamination from the infiltration, then we're going to point that out. But if we don't have that information in our response action plan, then we don't know you're doing it. So it's really this game of chicken and the egg. The stormwater program may know about it because it comes through their permit process, and maybe they do or don't review it, who knows. From our perspective as the remediation programs and brownfields programs, we only know about this if it's in the response action plan and you've applied and enrolled in the brownfields review process. So I encourage highly everybody that's listening to look into enrolling in the brownfields program when it's appropriate, when you have a contaminated site or a down gradient site from infiltration, so that you can have the information sharing with us and we can help you be better informed about those risk decisions and those liability decisions.
And I think if I understand, and Todd or Dwayne or Mike can jump in here, that if you come to the stormwater program first, we're generally not well positioned to take a look at these types of issues, contamination related issues. So
We would probably lean on Rebecca or somebody.
if it came to our attention, yeah.
Yeah.
And all of our VIC and PBP staff are looking for this information. Every single response action plan we review now, we're looking for that, and everybody has been well versed on what to look for and how to make sure that we have the right plan. One of the biggest problems we have is that when we get these reports, we don't have adequate design sheet attached. So maybe in the narrative of the plan, it says we're going to infiltrate on this site that has contamination. Maybe it's not a problem at all. That's fine. But we don't know anything more than that if it's not attached in a plan design. So we want to see that sheet of your plan. We want to see where that is, and especially where that is in relationship physically to the known contamination on site or off site. So the more information you give us in terms of location and depth and volume and all that sort of thing, the more of that we have, the better we can help you through the process.
Any other questions?
Not that I see here.
Randy's got one.
Yeah, who would have thought? There's a couple things. One is I'm really curious about the liability issues, and I'm gonna take that question to the legal folks at the League of Minnesota Cities for whatever that's worth. I'm curious. The PCA, you have multiple instances, in some cases directly related to these issues, where you are reviewing submittal materials. You've even used the word approved. And yet I'm sure that through this entire process, you're insulating the PCA from liability. How do you do that?
I start by saying I'm not an attorney.
Yeah.
And so I cannot speak to the legal aspects of this whatsoever, other than to say our approvals are only of response action in relationship to contamination. And so when we approve something from a brownfield standpoint, we're not approving the design, the installation, the performance of your BMP at all. We are simply making statements to the effect that we understand you plan to infiltrate, and your removal or your handling of your contaminated material, if you have designated it properly, is getting approved for how you're planning to respond to that contamination. And so really our limitations on that liability letter are thorough, and they are very and they're very thorough, is where I'll leave it. I'll just say that it is self-explanatory. When you read your response action approval letter, it covers very explicit things and only those things. And so it's not to be misconstrued as an approval of your design or your performance or any liability thereafter. It's only in relationship to protection of human health and the environment as that development is presented to us. So here again, if we don't know that somebody is infiltrating because they just didn't bother to include it, because their environmental professional developing the response action plan isn't talking to their stormwater person designing the infiltration, if that conversation isn't happening and that information isn't passed on to us, we have no way to know that. So it's to the betterment of everyone involved if the information is shared readily and frequently.
Do you have some boilerplate liability limitation language that you include in response letters?
Yeah, the approval letter contains, it's self-explanatory. Each letter is individualized to the site and based on the contaminants at the site. So you really have to, read each site approvals letter. So
we may look to language that you folks use. I don't know. That would. The other one that gets interesting in my mind is this whole question of relatively simple situations where there's a simple, quick, inexpensive review using the guidance in the stormwater manual. The local permitting authority, let's say it's an MS4 city, decides that infiltration should not be allowed. Then you've got possible pressure from a watershed district that won't permit the project without infiltration. But then on the other side, you also have the property owner who, if they end up doing infiltration, could be taking on liability. That's something we haven't talked about here at all. And we're gonna look into that and talk to folks and see how that's working out.
And Todd and I talked a little bit about that situation yesterday, and we don't have an answer,
Yeah.
It is a
Yeah,
tough, it is a tough.
and I don't think we're looking to you folks for an answer.
Yeah.
I found myself, we had that conversation earlier in this meeting about whether the PCA is saying that you prefer that infiltration not be done. And you stated quite clearly that that's not what the PCA is saying. One of the things that I think you may be saying, and I guess this is a question, is you may be saying that higher analytic review may be appropriate before infiltration is done. That seems to be a pattern that comes through all of this stuff.
Yeah, if there are any concerns at a site and you have the ability to do sampling, you should do sampling. Yeah.
Right.
And, because that's, the screening assessment's based on visual things, it's based on empirical tests and calculations. Those are substitutes, but in some cases not adequate substitutes for actually going out and collecting samples. So if you really want to infiltrate, or you have to in a site where you got concerns, you're going to need to sample.
Randy, people online are wondering who you are and what organization you represent.
Boy, is that, my first question's a long story. I'm representing the Minnesota City Stormwater Coalition, which is about 130 of the MS4 permitted cities in the state.
Okay. Randy Nieprash.
Yeah, sorry, Randy Nieprash.
Any other questions? My email address is up here. You can certainly send me questions and I'll find an appropriate person to answer them. That was supposed to be a joke.
Forrest from Kappa Region just added that he's not speaking for all watershed districts, but he cannot think of a scenario where they would force a development to infiltrate if there is contamination risk.
If there's what?
Contamination risk.
Right.
Okay,
Any other questions online? If not, Mike, your email's on the screen.
One last.
I have one last comment, which is, y'all did a really nice job with this. And seeing as we requested it, and it's clear that a lot of effort went into doing a really nice job with this, and just wanted to acknowledge that and say, partly on behalf of all the people on the web, it's greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you.
yeah, and it's a subject that is evolving, and we're quite aware that there's a lot of issues around it, and let us know if you have more questions. Let us know if there's resources we can develop. We'll do our best to try to accommodate those requests. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody for attending, and have a good day.
If anybody wants to glance at this report before they leave, I've got time to stick around and just to look through it.
Wow. Yeah.
Stuff on risk
today.
Yeah, no kidding.
But-
So if you end up talking to your legal team,
I-